Hello and welcome to this new course. This is the third in the Liberal Bookshelf suite of courses run by the ILB, after earlier courses about liberalism versus theory and the liberal knowledge industry. The subject of this new course is the future of liberalism. It explores how one possibility is that the liberalism of the future might profitably tap into a lost tradition of liberal thought. I'm going to explore this theme by discussing a book from 2018 by Professor Helena Rosenblatt of the Graduate School and University Centre of the City University of New York. Her book, The Lost History of Liberalism, goes through the French, German and British liberal traditions of the late 18th and 19th centuries, alerting readers to a rich tradition of forgotten liberal thought, which is waiting to be rediscovered. Rosenblatt's thesis is that not only did we lose a history of liberalism, but we also lost a particular kind of liberalism over the course of the 20th century. In this lecture, I'm going to start by providing an account of Rosenblatt's lost liberalism, before raising a couple of questions about why we should be interested in an alternative kind of liberalism today. I'll make the point that, for all its successes, liberalism, as we commonly understand it, has also produced negative outcomes, leading to a yearning for a different kind of politics, perhaps a different kind of liberalism. I'll suggest that the kind of liberalism Rosenblatt has in mind could prove popular in our times and in the future. And I'll finish up by comparing her view of liberalism with what some British commentators mean when they speak of a post-liberalism. So what does Rosenblatt have in mind when she speaks of a liberalism grounded in French, German and British thought in the 19th century? According to the author, the lost liberalism was fundamentally a morally grounded communitarian tradition that emerged from the French Revolution and was refined by 19th century French and German thinkers. Liberals were originally moralists at heart who believed in the possibility of reforming society, emphasised the sanctity of the family, and never spoke of rights without speaking of duties. Rather than an atomistic individualism concerned with the rights and interests of individuals, we find liberals concerned with social justice, civic values, and the moral development of citizens. French and German thinkers developed a conviction that the state had a moral obligation to tend to the common welfare, viewing individuals as social beings with ethical obligations towards others, rather than solitary, self-interested actors. This tradition emphasised generosity, virtue, the common good, and the state's role as a promoter of communal ethical life. All elements that Rosenblatt argues were purged from liberalism in the 20th century, as it became reframed as an individualistic, rights-oriented Anglo-American ideology focused primarily on personal freedoms rather than moral duties and social obligations. Late in her book, Rosenblatt tries to sum up what has been uncovered in a series of paragraphs, which I'll read in full, seeing as they sum up the argument so elegantly. Rosenblatt observes, over the course of the centuries, liberals consistently described their values as patriotic, selfless, and meant to promote the public good. When liberals fought for individual rights, it was because they thought that such rights enabled individuals to better perform their duties. Liberals constantly looked for ways to promote civic values. Morality was central to their goals. And she continues, all the liberals we have encountered in this book also believed that the purpose of governments was to serve the public good. At first this meant dismantling aristocratic impediments that kept wealth, power and opportunity in the hands of a hereditary elite. Later it entailed intervening to fight plutocracy and the exploitation that accompanied it. At every point, their underlying objective was to promote the material and moral well-being of all. From Benjamin Constant and his concern about fostering self-sacrifice, to Alexis de Tocqueville, who worried about selfishness, and Leonard Hobhouse and Herbert Crawley, who agonised about plutocracy, liberals were virtually obsessed with morality and the building of character. Personhood and character were words that suggested the ability and need of individuals to cultivate their moral and intellectual potential, to understand their interconnectedness with others, and to understand their civic duty. So, an alternative kind of liberalism. I'd like to proceed by comparing Rosenblatt's version of liberalism with that of Francis Fukuyama, and what he says about liberalism in his recent Liberalism and Its Discontents. Because the comparison between the two serves to raise important questions about Rosenblatt's ideas. So Fukuyama thinks of the late 20th century as a kind of golden age for liberalism. We often attribute the success of the West to democratic institutions, and Fukuyama talks about democracy as well as liberalism, but he's also at pains to emphasise that it's liberalism which lies behind the success of modern economies in the late 20th century. He states that the liberal commitment to property rights and the rule of law laid the basis for the strong post-Second World War economic growth. And he attributes the success of civil rights and feminist revolutions to liberalism as well. Those movements pressured societies to live up to the liberal principles of universal human dignity. He suggests, perhaps even more importantly, that when Americans look abroad, there is abundant evidence that liberalism is a very successful kind of political philosophy. He's especially interested in the success of a number of Asian countries, which went from being poor developing countries to developed economies in just a few decades. Fukuyama explicitly mentions Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong and Singapore. Interestingly, they were not democracies during their high growth periods, but they adopted what Fukuyama calls key liberal institutions, like protection of private property rights and openness to international trade. Of course, he's thinking about the successes of these economies prior to the East Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s. Fukuyama goes so far as to suggest that perhaps even the success of China has something to do with its adoption of certain liberal measures. He mentions the reforms instituted by Deng Xiaoping after 1978, such as the household responsibility law or the township and village enterprise system, which replaced central planning with limited property rights and incentives for peasants and entrepreneurs to take risks. And then, speaking of the important combination of liberalism and democracy, Fukuyama suggests that, and I quote again, liberalism's pairing with democracy tempered the inequalities created by market competition, and general prosperity enabled democratically elected legislatures to create redistributive welfare states. He goes on to claim that the late 20th century period, especially 1950 to 1980, was not just a period of economic growth, but one of increasing social equality. So in Fukuyama's view, the period from 1950 to 1980 is a veritable golden age for the kind of liberalism he has in mind. By contrast, in Rosenblatt's work, liberalism, at least a liberalism which took shape over time in France, Germany and the UK, late 18th century, 19th century, it enjoys no golden age in the second half of the 20th century. Rather, it becomes a somewhat forgotten legacy in that century. Perhaps Fukuyama's liberalism is a distant cousin of Rosenblatt's, but it is not her liberalism that impacts on the late 20th century. Perhaps we might then ask the question, given the apparent success of the American brand of liberalism, why should we be interested in a forgotten liberalism? Or to put it another way, why might we take an interest in promoting an alternative liberalism with historic roots in France and Germany? I might suggest that for all its strengths, US liberalism has proved not only a powerful force for improving human thriving in the US and elsewhere, but also a creed which develops in ways that are far from optimal. In the second half of the 20th century, to return to that time frame, liberalism also involved to embrace first the so-called permissive society, which drives conservatives mad, and second neoliberalism, which drives the left mad. Fukuyama, of course, dedicated much of his book to these unappealing developments. It will already be clear that Rosenblatt's liberalism avoids these pitfalls. A liberalism more grounded in the French and German traditions is a kind of liberalism which would promote neither lifestyle individualism nor economic laissez-faire. This alternative vision offers a compelling response to contemporary discontents, precisely because it addresses the twin excesses that have made modern liberalism controversial across the political spectrum. Where contemporary liberalism's emphasis on unfettered individual choice has led to what critics describe as moral relativism and the breakdown of traditional social bonds, Rosenblatt's Lost Liberalism maintains a strong commitment to moral development and civic virtue. It recognises that genuine human flourishing requires not just the absence of external constraints, but the cultivation of character within supportive social institutions. Similarly, where neoliberalism's faith in market mechanisms has produced growing inequality and the commodification of social relations, this earlier liberal tradition insisted that markets must serve moral and social purposes rather than becoming ends in themselves. Many of the French and German liberals Rosenblatt examines understood that unchecked capitalism could become as tyrannical as unchecked state power, and they developed frameworks for ensuring that economic activity contributed to the common good rather than undermining it. The possible upshot of recovering this tradition is that it might actually prove popular in our times, offering a path forward that neither abandons liberalism's core commitments to human dignity and progress, nor ignores the legitimate concerns that have fueled both conservative and progressive critiques of contemporary liberal practice. This synthesis could appeal to those who value individual freedom but worry about social fragmentation, and to those who support economic dynamism but are troubled by its social costs. Fukuyama, of course, has his own ideas about what went wrong with liberalism and what course correction should look like. His critique begins with the idea that the two problems associated with liberalism, alluded to above, represent extreme versions of liberalism. And he concludes that the doctrine is basically right in essence. But Rosenblatt's alternative account and diagnostics are fascinating, and her study of liberalism has the crucial advantage that it is more thoroughly grounded in what earlier thinkers meant when they spoke of liberalism. Last of all, I'd like to say something about post-liberalism. One of the ways in which dissatisfaction with liberalism has manifested is in the kind of thinking which promotes post-liberalism. This is interesting because Rosenblatt's liberalism is very close to what today defenders of a kind of centrist post-liberalism have in mind. In 2019, a writer by the name of M.T. Steiner, a congressional staffer based in DC, published a very thought-provoking piece titled Post-Liberal Politics, Left, Right and Centre. I'll proceed by running through one part of Steiner's essay, specifically the part about centrist post-liberal politics. Centrist post-liberals, Steiner tells us, occupy a middle ground that critiques liberalism while maintaining more space for egalitarianism than their right-wing counterparts. They prioritise society over both market and state, believing that true social progress emerges from local context rather than abstract principles or faith in government and economy. Steiner turns to British political commentator and associate editor of Unheard, Peter Franklin, who explains, "Post-liberals, like liberals, are pro-liberty, but unlike liberals, they do not believe that the maximization of personal freedom is the be-all and end-all of politics. Other things are important too, like family, community, nation, fairness and beauty. And therefore there are balances to be struck and conflicts to be resolved as an essential part of the democratic process. Post-liberals therefore believe that individuals have rights and duties." Steiner goes on, "This centrist post-liberal approach, emerging prominently in the United Kingdom, represents what British philosopher Adrian Pabst describes as embedding state agencies and market mechanisms within intermediary social institutions." Steiner alerts us to an article titled "Post-Liberalism, the New Centre Ground of British Politics," in which Pabst argues as follows. "By elevating society, centrist post-liberals inoculate themselves against the excesses of status temptation and promote virtue through the values, rights and duties tied to social institutions. In this sense, centrist post-liberals are less trigger-happy with state authority and less likely to disrupt the balance between rights and duties in society." Summing up his account of this kind of politics, Steiner observes, "Rather than following the mushy middle of third-way politics, these centrists occupy a hard centre that acknowledges liberalism's achievements while addressing its shortcomings of economic inequality, social atomization and political oligarchy." There is a remarkable convergence between Rosenblatt's Lost Liberalism and what Franklin and Pabst understand as centrist post-liberalism. Both traditions emphasize the fundamental importance of balancing rights with duties rather than prioritizing individual liberty as an absolute value. Rosenblatt's Lost Liberalism, with its morally grounded approach that viewed individuals as social beings with ethical obligations to others, closely mirrors Franklin's description of post-liberals who believe that individuals have rights and duties and that family, community, nation, fairness and beauty matter alongside personal freedom. Both Rosenblatt's 19th century European liberals and contemporary centrist post-liberals prioritize society over both state and market mechanisms. Rosenblatt's German liberal thinkers believed the state had a moral obligation to tend to the common welfare while embedding this within social institutions, precisely what Pabst describes when he speaks of embedding state agencies and market mechanisms in intermediary social institutions. Both traditions reject atomistic individualism in favour of what Rosenblatt calls social beings with ethical obligations, and what centrist post-liberals describe as promoting virtue through the values, rights and duties tied to social institutions. Rosenblatt's argument that there is another kind of liberalism in our intellectual heritage suggests that we don't need post-liberalism, not at least that British and centrist post-liberalism. Its proponents, after all, are more or less just speaking about this 19th century French and German tradition. This brings this mini-lecture to a close. In the second lecture of this course, I'll be joined by Helena Rosenblatt, who has agreed to explore further some of the themes I've discussed in this lecture. Join us for what will no doubt be a fascinating discussion about the possibility of a different kind of liberalism.
Thank you for listening. Please consider donating to the Institute for Liberal Values, a 501c3 nonprofit organization at ilvalues.org. All donations go to support our continued programming to realize our mission to provide the skills and support required to build community where there has been division, to encourage free expression where there has been censorship, and to foster optimism where there is fear.